My name is Victoria Sterling, and for the past 3 years, I have worked as a maid in the opulent mansion of Richard Blackwood, one of the wealthiest men in the country. To him, I was nothing more than invisible help, someone who cleaned his floors, dusted his priceless artifacts, and served his meals without ever being truly seen or acknowledged as a human being with her own story, her own intelligence, and her own remarkable skills. Richard Blackwood was the kind of man who believed that wealth automatically granted him superiority over everyone else. He treated his staff like disposable objects, speaking to us with condescension and cruelty that revealed the emptiness of his character despite his overflowing bank accounts. But what Richard didn't know, what he could never have imagined in his arrogant assumptions, was that the quiet maid who cleaned his study every morning had a background that would have shocked him to his core before circumstances forced me into domestic service. I had been Dr. Victoria Sterling, a master horologist with a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT. I had spent 15 years restoring some of the world's most precious timepieces, working with museums, private collectors, and auction houses to bring centuries-old mechanisms back to life. My expertise in clockwork was so renowned that I had been invited to restore pieces for the Smithsonian, the British Museum, and private collections worth millions of dollars, but life has a way of humbling even the most accomplished among us. When my husband died in a car accident, leaving me with crushing medical debt and legal fees from a malpractice lawsuit that destroyed our savings, I lost everything. My workshop, my reputation, my identity, all of it disappeared in a cascade of financial ruin that forced me to take whatever work I could find to survive. That's how Dr. Victoria Sterling became Victoria the maid, cleaning the mansion of a man who would never suspect that the woman scrubbing his floors possessed knowledge and skills that far exceeded his own understanding of the precious objects that filled his home. Richard's mansion was a monument to his ego, filled with priceless antiques, rare artworks, and collectibles that he had acquired not out of genuine appreciation, but simply because their value impressed others. He would host elaborate dinner parties where he would boast about his possessions to guests who feigned interest while secretly mocking his obvious insecurity behind his back. Among his most prized possessions was a collection of antique clocks that filled an entire room on the second floor. There were grandfather clocks from the 18th century, intricate mantel clocks from renowned European craftsmen, and astronomical clocks that displayed not just time but the movements of celestial bodies. Richard loved to tell guests that his clock collection was worth more than most people's houses, though it was clear he knew nothing about the actual mechanisms or history of these magnificent timepieces. Every morning, as I dusted and cleaned the clock room, I would examine these beautiful machines with the eye of an expert. I could see which ones needed adjustment, which had been improperly maintained, and which were slowly deteriorating due to neglect. It pained me to see such masterpieces of craftsmanship being treated as mere decorative objects by someone who couldn't appreciate their true beauty and complexity. The most magnificent piece in Richard's collection was an 18th century astronomical clock created by the legendary clockmaker Abraham Louis Breguet. This wasn't just a timepiece, it was a mechanical marvel that displayed the time, date, moon phases, and positions of several planets with incredible precision. The clock had been in Richard's family for generations, passed down from his great-great-grandfather, who had purchased it directly from Breguet's workshop in Paris. For months, I had noticed that this extraordinary clock was running slow and its astronomical functions were becoming increasingly inaccurate. The delicate mechanisms inside were crying out for the attention of someone who understood their intricate workings. But Richard, in his ignorance, seemed oblivious to the deteriorating condition of his most valuable timepiece. The moment that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was cleaning the clock room when Richard entered with his usual air of superiority, followed by 3 guests he was obviously trying to impress, 2 business associates and a woman who appeared to be a potential investor in one of his ventures. "And this," Richard announced with his characteristic pompous tone, "is my world-renowned clock collection. Some of these pieces are worth more than luxury cars." He gestured grandly toward the Breguet astronomical clock, which at that moment was displaying the wrong time and had clearly stopped tracking the lunar phases correctly. "This particular piece," he continued, completely unaware of its malfunction, "is an original Breguet from 1784. It's worth at least $500,000. And is considered one of the finest examples of 18th century clockmaking in private hands. One of his guests, a woman who apparently knew something about antique timepieces, stepped closer to examine the clock. "It's beautiful," she said, "but isn't it running slow? And the moon phase display seems to be incorrect." Richard's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized that his prized possession was malfunctioning in front of the very people he was trying to impress. It's just a minor adjustment needed," he stammered. "These old clocks require constant maintenance." "Have you had it serviced recently?" asked one of the business associates. "A clock of this caliber should be maintained by a master horologist." "Of course," Richard lied smoothly. "I have the finest clockmakers in the country working on my collection." But I could see the panic in his eyes. He had no idea how to fix the clock, and calling in a real expert would expose his neglect and potentially cost him thousands of dollars, money he would have to spend in front of these guests, revealing that his finest clockmakers were fictional.in. His desperation, Richard's gaze fell on me as I continued dusting nearby, and I saw a cruel idea form in his mind. "In fact," he said with a malicious smile, "I believe in giving opportunities to everyone in my household. Victoria here has been admiring this clock for months. Perhaps she'd like to try her hand at fixing it." His guests looked at him with confusion and discomfort. It was clear they thought he was making a joke in poor taste. "Richard," the woman investor said carefully, "surely you're not serious. This is an extremely valuable and delicate antique." "Oh. But I am serious," Richard replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "Victoria, come here." I approached reluctantly, knowing that Richard was setting me up for humiliation. He wanted to demonstrate his power over his staff while deflecting attention from his own ignorance about the clock's condition. "Victoria," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I want you to repair this clock. You've been cleaning around it for months, so surely you must have learned something about how it works." His guests shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the cruelty of what Richard was doing. But Richard was enjoying himself, reveling in what he saw as a perfect opportunity to entertain his guests at my expense. "Sir," I said quietly, "I don't think that would be appropriate." "Nonsense," Richard laughed. "I insist. In fact, I'll make it interesting. If you can get this clock running properly again, I'll give you a bonus of $1,000. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll admit in front of everyone here that you're nothing more than a simple maid who doesn't understand the first thing about fine craftsmanship." The room fell silent. Richard's guests were clearly appalled by his behavior, but they were also curious to see how this humiliating scenario would play out. I stood there for a moment, looking at the magnificent Breguet clock that I had been longing to properly examine and restore for months. This was the moment I had to make a choice: continue hiding my true identity and expertise, or reveal who I really was and show Richard Blackwood that he had been underestimating the wrong person. "Sir," I said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in 3 years, "are you certain you want me to work on this clock?" "Absolutely," Richard replied with a cruel smile. "I can't wait to see what our little maid thinks she knows about horology." His use of the technical term for clockmaking was clearly meant to sound impressive to his guests, but I could tell from his pronunciation that he barely understood what the word meant. "Very well," I said, moving toward the clock. "But I should warn you that once I begin, there's no going back. And you might not like what you discover." Richard laughed loudly. "The only thing I'm going to discover is that my maid has delusions of grandeur. Please, proceed. Show us your expertise." As I approached the Breguet clock, I felt a familiar excitement that I hadn't experienced in years. This was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a symphony of gears, springs, and escapements that represented the pinnacle of 18th century craftsmanship. And for the first time in 3 years, I was about to do what I was truly meant to do. I began by carefully examining the clock face, noting the specific ways in which the time and astronomical displays were incorrect. Then I moved to the side of the case, where I knew the access panels would be located. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, suddenly sounding less confident. "I'm preparing to open the case and examine the movement," I replied, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I had used when lecturing at MIT. The symptoms suggest that the mainspring tension is incorrect, the escapement needs adjustment, and the astronomical gear train has probably been disturbed by improper handling. Richard's guests exchanged glances. My sudden transformation from submissive maid to confident expert was clearly unexpected. You can't just open that case, Richard protested. You'll damage it. Sir, I said, turning to face him with a smile. You asked me to repair this clock. Did you change your mind? Richard was trapped by his own arrogance. He couldn't back down now without losing face in front of his guests, but he was clearly beginning to realize that I might actually know what I was doing. No, he said reluctantly. Continue. I turned back to the clock and carefully opened the access panel, revealing the intricate movement inside. The sight of those perfectly crafted gears and springs, even in their current state of disrepair, filled me with a joy I had almost forgotten. My God, whispered one of Richard's guests, looking over my shoulder. Look at all those gears. This, I said, my voice filled with the passion I had always felt for my craft, is what real artistry looks like. Abraham Louis Breguet didn't just make clocks, he created mechanical poetry. And with that, I began to work, my hands moving with the precision and confidence of someone who had spent decades mastering one of the world's most demanding crafts. Richard Blackwood was about to discover that the woman he had treated as invisible help for 3 years was actually one of the most skilled horologists in the world. The transformation was about to begin, and Richard's world of assumptions and prejudices was about to be shattered as completely as if it were made of the finest crystal that I began to examine the intricate movement of the Breguet astronomical clock. The room fell into a hushed silence that was broken only by the soft ticking of the other timepieces surrounding us. Richard's guests moved closer, drawn by a curiosity that was clearly mixed with disbelief at what they were witnessing. Here was a maid, someone they had barely noticed when they entered the room, displaying a level of expertise and confidence that seemed to transform her very identity before their eyes. The first thing you need to understand about a Breguet astronomical clock, I said, my voice taking on the instructional tone I had used during my years as a professor, is that it's not simply a timepiece. It's a mechanical computer that calculates and displays the movements of celestial bodies with mathematical precision that was revolutionary for its time. I carefully removed a small panel to reveal the mainspring barrel, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had worked on similar mechanisms hundreds of times. The problem here, I continued, is immediately apparent to anyone who understands the principles of horological engineering. The mainspring has been overwound. Probably by someone who didn't understand the delicate balance required in a mechanism of this complexity. Richard's face had gone pale. Overwound? But I had it serviced just last year. Sir, I said, not looking up from my examination, whoever serviced this clock was not qualified to work on a piece of this caliber. In fact, they've caused damage that could have been catastrophic if left uncorrected much longer. One of Richard's guests, the woman who had first noticed the clock's malfunction, leaned closer. How can you tell all that just by looking at it? Because, I replied, carefully adjusting a tension screw with movements so precise they seemed almost surgical. I've been working with mechanisms like this for over 15 years. This particular type of astronomical movement was Breguet's specialty, and I've restored dozens of similar pieces for museums and private collectors around the world. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard was staring at me as if I had suddenly sprouted wings and begun speaking in ancient languages. That's impossible, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're a maid. You clean houses. I am a maid, I confirmed, still focused on my work. But I'm also Dr. Victoria Sterling, formerly of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I held the Whitman Chair in Mechanical Engineering with a specialization in precision timekeeping mechanisms. The woman investor gasped audibly. Dr. Victoria Sterling? I know that name. You're the horologist who restored the Harrison Marine chronometers for the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Among other projects, yes, I replied, making a delicate adjustment to the escapement mechanism. I also worked on the restoration of the Strasbourg Cathedral astronomical clock and consulted on the repair of several pieces in the Smithsonian's collection. Richard looked as if he might faint. But how? Why are you working as a maid? Because, Mr. Blackwood, I said, finally looking up from the clock to meet his eyes directly, life doesn't always follow the trajectory we plan. Sometimes circumstances force us to take whatever work we can find to survive. But expertise doesn't disappear just because someone's circumstances change. I returned my attention to the clock, carefully examining the astronomical gear train that controlled the moon phase and planetary displays. The secondary problem, I continued, is that someone has attempted to fix the astronomical functions without understanding how they integrate with the main timekeeping mechanism. They've actually made the clock less accurate by trying to adjust components they didn't understand. How long will it take you to repair it properly? Asked one of the business associates, clearly fascinated by what he was witnessing. For a complete restoration? Several weeks, working with proper tools and replacement parts. But I can make immediate adjustments that will restore basic functionality and accuracy within the next hour. Richard was standing frozen, clearly struggling to process the revelation that the woman he had treated with such condescension for 3 years was actually one of the world's leading experts in the very field represented by his most prized possessions. "Dr. Sterling," said the woman investor, "may I ask what happened? How did someone with your credentials end up working as domestic help?" I finished. It's not an uncommon story, unfortunately. My husband died in a car accident 3 years ago. The medical bills and legal fees from a subsequent malpractice lawsuit destroyed our savings. I lost my workshop, my home, and eventually my professional reputation when I couldn't fulfill contracted restoration projects. When you're facing homelessness, you take whatever work you can find. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was filled with respect rather than curiosity. "But surely," said one of the guests, "with your expertise, you could have found work in your field." "You might think so," I replied, making another precise adjustment, "but the world of high-end restoration is very small and very insular. Once word spreads that you've had financial difficulties, clients become nervous about entrusting you with million-dollar artifacts. And without a workshop or the capital to purchase proper tools and equipment, it becomes impossible to take on the kind of projects that would restore your reputation." As I worked, I could feel the entire dynamic in the room shifting. Richard's guests were no longer seeing me as entertainment in his cruel game, they were witnessing the work of a true master craftsman, and their respect was palpable. "The irony," I continued, "is that I've been watching this clock deteriorate for months, knowing exactly what was wrong and how to fix it, but unable to say anything because my position here depends on remaining invisible." "This is incredible," whispered one of the guests, watching as I made microscopic adjustments to gears that were smaller than coins. "The precision required for this kind of work is the result of decades of training and practice," I said. "Horology is one of the few remaining crafts where everything must be done by hand, where the difference between success and failure is measured in fractions of millimeters." I carefully adjusted the moon phase mechanism, aligning it with the current lunar cycle using calculations I performed in my head. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, "when was the last time you actually looked at this clock's displays? Really looked at them?" I look at it every day," Richard stammered. "But do you understand what you're looking at? Do you know that this clock doesn't just show the phases of the moon, it predicts them months in advance? Do you realize that the small dial on the upper right displays the equation of time, showing the difference between solar time and clock time throughout the year?" Richard's silence was answer enough. "This clock," I continued, "represents knowledge and craftsmanship that took Breguet decades to perfect. It's not just a decoration or a status symbol, it's a testament to human ingenuity and the pursuit of precision that borders on the divine." As I made the final adjustments to the main escapement, the clock's rhythm suddenly changed. The irregular, labored ticking that had characterized its operation for months was replaced by the smooth, precise beat of a perfectly regulated timepiece. "There," I said, stepping back from the clock. "The basic timekeeping function is now accurate to within seconds per day, and all astronomical displays are properly synchronized." The guests moved closer to examine the clock face, and their amazement was evident. The time is exactly correct, said the woman investor, checking it against her watch. And look, said one of the business associates, the moon phase display now matches the actual lunar cycle. Richard approached the clock slowly, as if he were afraid it might explode. For the first time in months, his prized possession was functioning as its creator had intended. How did you? He began, then stopped, clearly overwhelmed by what he had witnessed. Mr. Blackwood, I said, you asked me to repair your clock, and I have done so. According to our agreement, I believe you owe me $1,000 bonus. But even as I said it, I knew that money was no longer the point. Something much more significant had happened in this room. Richard's entire worldview, his assumptions about class, education, and the value of human beings, had been shattered. As completely as if I had taken a hammer to his precious timepiece. Dr. Sterling, said the woman investor, I hope you won't take this as presumptuous, but I represent several private collectors who are always looking for qualified restoration experts. Would you be interested in discussing some potential projects? 4. The first time in 3 years, I felt a spark of hope that I might be able to return to the work I loved. I would be very interested, I replied. Though I should mention that I would need time to re-establish my workshop and acquire proper tools. That could be arranged, she said. The right restoration expert is worth any reasonable investment in equipment. Richard stood in stunned silence, watching as his guests began discussing business opportunities with the woman he had been paying minimum wage to clean his floors. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 years had been completely reversed, and he was struggling to comprehend how thoroughly his assumptions had been proven wrong. Dr. Sterling, he said finally, his voice barely audible, I had no idea, no, I said, meeting his eyes with a directness that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier, you didn't. Because you never bothered to see me as anything more than hired help. You never asked about my background, my education, or my experience. You assumed that because I was cleaning your house, I was somehow less intelligent or capable than you. The truth of my words hung in the air like a physical presence. Richard's guests were clearly uncomfortable, recognizing the justice in my criticism of their host's behavior. But the most tragic part, I continued, is that you've been surrounded by beauty and craftsmanship that you don't understand or appreciate. You own some of the finest timepieces ever created, but you treat them like trophies rather than the masterpieces they are. As I spoke, I realized that this moment represented more than just the repair of a clock or even the revelation of my hidden identity. It was a reckoning, a moment when years of accumulated injustice and disrespect were finally being addressed. Richard Blackwood was about to learn that intelligence, skill, and worth are not determined by someone's current circumstances, and that the people he had dismissed as beneath his notice might possess knowledge and abilities that far exceeded his own. The final chapter of this transformation was about to unfold. And nothing in Richard's carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice would ever be the same again. The silence that followed my words seemed to stretch for an eternity. Richard stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine shame. His guests exchanged meaningful glances, clearly recognizing that they had witnessed something far more significant than the simple repair of a clock. They had seen the complete dismantling of their host's arrogance and prejudice. Dr. Sterling, the woman investor said, breaking the tension, I'm Margaret Whitfield, and I represent the Whitfield Foundation. We specialize in preserving historical artifacts and supporting master craftspeople. I would very much like to discuss a partnership with you. Mrs. Whitfield, I replied, I'm familiar with your foundation's work. You've funded some of the most important restoration projects in the world. Indeed we have. And based on what I've just witnessed, I believe we could offer you not just individual projects, but the opportunity to establish a fully equipped workshop with our backing. The level of skill you've demonstrated here is exactly what we've been seeking. Richard's face went from pale to ashen as he realized that his cruel game had backfired spectacularly. Not only had he been humiliated in front of his guests, but he was now watching as they offered me opportunities that could restore my career and reputation. "There's something else," said one of the business associates, a distinguished man who had been quietly observing everything. "I'm James Morrison, and I own Morrison Auction House. We handle some of the most valuable timepieces in the world, and we're always in need of qualified restoration experts for presale preparation." "Mr. Morrison," I said, recognizing the name. "Your auction house has an impeccable reputation. I would be honored to work with you." "The honor would be ours, Dr. Sterling. In fact, I have a Patek Philippe astronomical clock coming up for auction next month that needs restoration. The commission alone would be substantial, certainly enough to help you re-establish your workshop." Richard watched this exchange with growing horror, realizing that his attempt to humiliate me had instead provided me with exactly the opportunities one needed to escape his employment and return to my true profession. "Wait," he said desperately, "Dr. Sterling, surely we can work something out. I mean, you've been happy here for 3 years, happy?" I turned to face him directly, and for the first time in our relationship, he actually took a step backward. "Mr. Blackwood, I have spent 3 years cleaning your house while you treated me like I was invisible. You've never once asked about my background, my interests, or my aspirations. You've spoken to me with condescension and disrespect, and today, you tried to humiliate me in front of your guests for your own entertainment." "But I didn't know, you didn't know because you didn't care to know," I interrupted. "You assumed that because I was working as your maid, I was somehow inferior to you. You never considered that I might have skills, knowledge, or experience that could be valuable to you." Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward. "Dr. Sterling, if I may ask, how many pieces in Mr. Blackwood's collection would benefit from professional restoration?" I looked around the room, my expert eye cataloging the various timepieces and their conditions. "Nearly all of them," I said. "Honestly, that grandfather clock in the corner has a pendulum that's been incorrectly weighted. The mantel clock on the fireplace has a spring that's about to snap. The astronomical clock we just worked on needs a complete overhaul to restore it to museum quality. And that bracket clock near the window has been wound incorrectly for so long that its mechanism is under dangerous stress." "And what would proper restoration of this entire collection cost?" asked Mr. Morrison. I did quick calculations in my head, considering the complexity of each piece and the time required for proper restoration. "For a complete, museum-quality restoration of everything in this room? Probably between $200,000 and $300,000, depending on what replacement parts need to be fabricated." Richard's jaw dropped. $300,000. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, "you claim this collection is worth millions. But you've been allowing it to deteriorate through neglect and improper maintenance. Some of these pieces have lost significant value due to damage that could have been prevented with proper care." "But surely that's an exaggeration, is it?" Mrs. Whitfield interjected. "Mr. Blackwood, I've seen collections destroyed by exactly this kind of neglect." Dr. Sterling is being conservative in her estimates. Mr. Morrison nodded in agreement. "I've had to withdraw pieces from auction because they were in such poor condition that they couldn't meet our quality standards. The financial loss to the consignors was substantial." Richard looked around his prized collection with new eyes, suddenly seeing not impressive trophies but deteriorating assets that were losing value every day. "Dr. Sterling," he said desperately, "what if I hired you to restore my collection? I could pay you properly, treat you with the respect you deserve." "Mr. Blackwood," I replied calmly, 3 hours ago, you were paying me minimum wage to clean your floors. You tried to humiliate me in front of your guests by asking me to work on a priceless antique, expecting me to fail so you could mock my delusions of grandeur. And now that you've discovered I'm actually an expert in this field, you want to hire me as a restoration specialist." "Well, yes. I mean, it makes sense now that I know who you really are. But here's the problem," I continued. "My consulting rate for restoration work is $500 per hour, with a minimum commitment of 40 hours per week. For a project of this scope, you'd be looking at an initial investment of at least $80,000 just for my time, not including materials and equipment." Richard's face went white as he realized the financial implications. $80,000? But that's more than I pay you in 3 years. Exactly, I said. Because you've been paying me to clean floors, not to use my actual skills and expertise. The work I just performed on your Breguet clock would normally cost between $5,000 and $10,000 if done by a qualified horologist. Mrs. Whitfield smiled. Dr. Sterling, I think our foundation would be very interested in funding a comprehensive restoration of significant private collections. Mr. Blackwood, if you're serious about properly maintaining your timepieces, we could arrange for Dr. Sterling to work on your collection as part of a larger preservation initiative. That's wonderful, Richard said, though he looked anything but pleased at the prospect of paying professional rates for work he had been getting for minimum wage. Of course, I added, there would be conditions. I would need a formal contract, professional working conditions, and the understanding that this would be a business relationship between equals, not an employer-servant dynamic. Naturally, said Mr. Morrison. Dr. Sterling, given your expertise, you should also consider offering authentication services. There are many collectors who would pay substantial fees to have their pieces properly evaluated and certified. As the conversation continued, I watched Richard's expression change from shock to resignation to something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. He was finally beginning to understand that the woman he had dismissed as just a maid possessed knowledge and skills that were far more valuable than anything he had ever accomplished. Dr. Sterling, he said finally, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for the past 3 years. I treated you badly, and I was wrong. Yes, I said simply, you were. Is there any way I can make this right? I considered his question carefully. Richard Blackwood had spent 3 years treating me with disrespect and condescension, but he was also offering me an opportunity to return to the work I loved. Mr. Blackwood, I said, if you're serious about making this right, then you need to understand that this isn't just about money or business opportunities. It's about recognizing that every person has value, regardless of their current circumstances. It's about treating people with dignity and respect, not because of what they can do for you, but because they're human beings who deserve basic courtesy. I understand, he said, and for the first time since I had known him, he seemed genuinely humble. I hope you do, I replied. Because the lesson here isn't just about my particular situation. It's about how you treat all the people who work for you, and how you view people whose circumstances might be different from yours. Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward again. Dr. Sterling, regardless of what you decide about Mr. Blackwood's collection, I want to extend a formal offer from the Whitfield Foundation. We would like to sponsor the establishment of your new workshop and provide funding for several major restoration projects. Mrs. Whitfield, that's an incredibly generous offer. It's not generosity, it's good business. Master craftspeople like you are rare, and your skills are too valuable to be wasted on other pursuits. As I looked around the room at these successful, accomplished people who were now treating me with the respect and recognition I had earned through decades of study and practice, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years, hope for the future. Mr. Blackwood, I said, turning back to Richard, I'll give you my resignation effective immediately. But I'll also give you a proposal. If you're serious about properly maintaining your collection, I'll work with Mrs. Whitfield's foundation to develop a restoration plan that will not only preserve your timepieces, but increase their value significantly. Yes, I would like that very much. Good. But understand that from now on, we'll be working together as professionals, not as employer and servant. And I expect you to extend the same courtesy and respect to every member of your staff. Of course, Richard said, and I could see that he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his previous behavior. As we concluded our discussion and made plans for future collaboration, I reflected on the strange turns that life can take. 3 years ago, I had lost everything and been forced to take work that seemed to represent the complete destruction of my professional identity. But today, that same work had led to opportunities that might restore not just my career, but my sense of purpose and self-worth. Richard Blackwood had learned that intelligence, skill, and human value aren't determined by someone's current job title or economic circumstances. And I had learned that sometimes the most unlikely situations can provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate who you really are. The broken clock had been repaired, but more importantly, broken assumptions about class, worth, and human dignity had been shattered and replaced with something much more valuable: understanding, respect, and the recognition that every person has the potential to surprise us if we're wise enough to look beyond the surface. I left Richard's mansion that day, no longer as his maid but as Dr. Victoria Sterling, master horologist. I carried with me not just new opportunities, but the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, justice arrives with the precision of a perfectly calibrated timepiece, exactly when it's needed most. The END warning: legal notice. This story is completely fictional and was created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.